There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside certain people. Not the silence of peace. Not the kind that comes after a long exhale, after a good day, after the world finally gives you a moment to just be still. This is a different silence. Heavier, more practice. It's the silence of someone who has learned very early, very quietly, that her voice takes up too much space. Her name is Lara, and this is the story of everything she gave away, trying to make sure no one would ever leave. She grew up in a house where love always felt conditional, not cruel. Nothing as clear as cruelty. Her parents weren't monsters. They were just people, tired, distracted, running on routines that had long replaced intention. And in that house, Lara learned one of the earliest and most damaging lessons a child can absorb, that the way to keep people close is to never ask for too much. She watched. She observed. She noticed that when she cried too loudly, the room got tense. That when she said she didn't want something, there was a shift in the air, a subtle withdrawal, a look, a silence that felt louder than any argument. So she stopped saying she didn't want things. She was 7 years old the first time she smiled through something she hated. She was 9 the first time she agreed with something she knew was wrong. She was 12 the first time she felt proud of herself for making someone else comfortable at the cost of her own. By the time she was 26, she had no idea she was doing any of it. People describe Lara the way you describe a warm day in late spring. Easy, pleasant, no sharp edges anywhere. Her co-workers loved her. Her friends relied on her. Her mother called her every Sunday and always got off the phone feeling better about herself. Her manager praised her in team meetings. Her neighbors liked her because she never complained, not about the noise, not about the parking, not about anything. She was, by every external measure, delightful. She kept her apartment clean. She remembered birthdays. She always replied to messages. She brought food when someone was sick. She stayed late when it was needed. She laughed at jokes she didn't find funny. She nodded at opinions she privately found absurd. She was 26 years old, and she had become, with extraordinary precision, exactly who everyone around her needed her to be. The only problem was that she couldn't tell you who she was when no one was watching. She worked at a mid-sized marketing firm. The kind of place where the open office layout was meant to signal collaboration, but mostly just meant that you could never truly be alone with your thoughts. The kind of place where people spoke in frameworks and called exhaustion dedication. Lara had been there for 3 years. She was good at her job, genuinely good, but her goodness had long since been repurposed. Her talent wasn't being used to advance her ideas. It was being used to make other people's ideas more presentable. Her manager, a man named Daniel, was the kind of person who mistook agreeableness for admiration. He had started sending his work to Lara for review. Then he had started asking her to present findings she hadn't developed. Then he had started CCing her on his emails, as though her presence were a kind of endorsement. She had said nothing, not because she didn't notice. She noticed everything, but because the cost of saying something always felt higher than the cost of staying quiet. So she stayed quiet, and the machine continued. Outside of work, there was Marcus. They had been together for 2 years. He was handsome in that easy way, the kind of handsome that makes people assume competence. He was funny when he wanted to be, which was mostly when others were around. He had a habit of making decisions for both of them and calling it spontaneity. Lara had told herself early on that she liked that about him, that it took the pressure off. She told herself this for a long time. They went to restaurants he chose, watched films he wanted, spent weekends with his friends, visited his family for holidays, made plans around his schedule. And Lara, who had once had opinions about all of these things, had slowly, quietly stopped having opinions about any of them. It didn't happen suddenly. It never does. It happened the way water-shaped stone, gradually, imperceptibly, until one day the stone is something else entirely and doesn't remember being anything other than what it's been worn into. The first real warning sign came on a Tuesday. She was sitting in her apartment. Marcus was out. She had the evening to herself, and she realized she didn't know what she wanted to do. Not in a tired way, not in a distracted way, in a deeper, stranger way. She stood in the middle of her living room, and she couldn't answer a simple question. What do you want to do tonight? She thought about it. Genuinely tried. She could watch something. But what? She scanned through streaming services for 40 minutes and couldn't land on a single thing. Every choice she considered, she immediately filtered through someone else's potential reaction. Would Marcus like this? Would her friend Sophia have already recommended this? Was this the kind of thing someone like her should be watching? Someone like her. She caught that thought and held it for a moment. Who was someone like her? She ordered food she didn't want, from a place she'd been to 100 times, because it was familiar and required no decision-making beyond a few taps on a screen. She ate it on the couch. She didn't taste it. She went to bed early and lay in the dark for a long time before sleep came, with a vague and nameless feeling in her chest that she told herself was just tiredness. It wasn't tiredness. The anxiety had always been there. She just had other names for it. Being considerate, being thoughtful, being responsible. She called it that when she rehearsed conversations before having them, when she went over what she'd said after every social interaction, cataloging potential offenses, rewinding moments, checking and rechecking the emotional temperature of people around her. She called it thoroughness when she drafted text messages and then deleted them and then rewrote them and then waited 20 minutes before sending them so as not to seem eager. She called it being a good listener when she spent entire conversations thinking about the other person's reaction rather than what she actually wanted to say. She was very good at renaming things, but the anxiety didn't care what she called it. It kept growing, quiet and consistent, like something taking root in a place where light never reached. April, a Sunday, she had plans with her friend Camila. Lunch, just the two of them, something they'd been trying to do for weeks. The morning of, she woke up feeling wrong. Not sick, exactly, but hollow, heavy, like something essential had been used up in the night and hadn't replenished. She lay there for a while, looked at the ceiling. She thought about canceling, thought about saying she wasn't feeling well, which was technically true even if she couldn't name what was wrong. She thought about how the afternoon felt like more than she had to give right now. Then she thought about how Camila would feel. And she got up, showered, put on clothes, and went. At lunch, she was wonderful. She laughed at the right moments. She asked the right questions. She listened, really listened, with her full face and her full attention. She said what needed to be said in the pauses. She was present and warm and genuinely glad to be there. Until she wasn't. Somewhere around the second hour, a thing happened that she would think about for a long time afterward. Camila was talking about something, a situation at work. The details don't matter. And she was asking Lara's opinion. Directly, what do you think? Tell me honestly. And Lara opened her mouth to speak. And there was nothing there. Not the polished, careful, appropriate response she usually assembled. Not even the quiet version of her real thoughts that she normally kept behind performative ones. Nothing, just a blankness, a static, a place where herself was supposed to be. She recovered quickly. She laughed a little, said something about still processing, gave an answer that was warm and gentle and completely without content. Camila seemed satisfied. Lara drove home and sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before going inside. She started noticing things after that, how she moved through the world, the way she automatically softened her posture when entering a room where she sensed tension, the way she monitored the faces of people around her, the way someone monitors weather, always checking, always adjusting, always preparing for the possibility of a shift, the way she apologized, constantly, preemptively, for things that hadn't happened yet, for space she hadn't taken, for opinions she hadn't even expressed, the way she could be with Marcus for an entire evening and never once say anything true. She started to ask herself, very quietly, a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. When was the last time you did something because you wanted to? She went back a week, a month, 3 months. She kept finding things she'd done for other people, decisions made around other people's comfort, choices filtered through other people's expectations. She pushed further back, and the further she pushed, the harder it got to find herself in any of it. The relationship with Marcus started to feel different that spring. Not worse, exactly, just more visible. She began to see the shape of it, the actual shape, not the one she'd been narrating to herself. And it was not the shape of two people. It was the shape of one person and their mirror. He talked. She reflected. He decided. She accommodated. He expressed. She absorbed. And when she thought about changing that, about saying, actually, I'd rather not, or actually, that's not what I want, or actually, let me tell you what I think, she felt something that she could only describe as terror. Not rational terror. Not the fear of something specific. Just the old, deep, bone-level fear that if she became inconvenient, she would become unwanted, that if she took up space, she would be asked to leave it. And so, she didn't change anything. She added more layers of performance instead, smiled a little wider, agreed a little faster, disappeared a little further. There's a kind of loneliness that is uniquely unbearable. It isn't the loneliness of being alone. That kind you can work with. You can feel it or sit with it or move through it. This is a loneliness of being with people, surrounded by people, loved by people, needed by people, and still feeling completely unreachable. It's the loneliness of being known only as a version of yourself you constructed for other people's comfort. It's the loneliness of performing warm so consistently that no one notices you've gone cold inside. Lara knew this loneliness intimately. She had been living inside it for so long it had started to feel like home. June, a work project went wrong. Not catastrophically. The kind of wrong that is messy and requires difficult conversations, and means someone has to say something uncomfortable to someone else. In a meeting, Daniel made a decision that Lara knew was wrong. She had data to contradict it. She had spent the previous week building a case for a different approach. She had the information, the reasoning, the preparation. She sat in that meeting and said nothing. She watched him make the decision. She nodded at points where nodding was required. She answered clarifying questions. She was professional and measured and helpful in all the ways she always was. And when the meeting ended, she went to the bathroom and stood at the sink for a long time. Her hands were shaking, not from anger, or not only from anger, from recognition. She looked at herself in the mirror, the professional clothes, the managed expression, the held-together surface of someone who always knows what to do in a room. And for just a second, the surface flickered. She saw something underneath it, something tired, something that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. She turned the tap on, cold water, washed her hands twice, for longer than necessary. When she went back to her desk, she sent Daniel a follow-up email that was thorough and supportive and contained nothing of what she actually thought. The panic attack started in July, not dramatic ones. Nothing that looked like panic from the outside. Just moments, usually in the morning, usually while getting ready, where the weight of the day ahead became suddenly, overwhelmingly physical, where her chest tightened and her thoughts accelerated, and the mundane structure of her life felt, briefly, like a cage she had built with her own hands. They passed quickly. She got good at them. She breathed through them, carried on, told herself it was stress, which was true, but incomplete. She didn't tell anyone. Not Marcus, not Camila, not her mother, because telling people would require explaining, and explaining would require them to ask questions, and their questions would require her to have answers, and her answers, she suspected, would be far too honest for anyone's comfort, including her own. Late July, a Friday evening, she and Marcus were supposed to go to a dinner party at the home of friends she'd never particularly liked, but had always been warmed toward because they mattered to him. She was standing in the hallway, coat on, ready to leave, and she didn't move. Marcus called from the living room. Ready? She stood there, coat on, hand near the door, and something in her simply didn't respond. Not rebellion, not refusal, more like a system that had been running too long on too little and had finally, quietly stalled. She walked into the living room and said, "I don't think I can go tonight." Marcus looked up. He wasn't unkind about it. He wasn't cruel. He asked if she was okay. He said, of course, no problem. He said he'd make an excuse for her. He was, by all reasonable measures, understanding. But later, after he'd left, she sat on the floor of her bedroom, not the bed, the floor, and cried in a way she hadn't cried in years. Not about the dinner, not about Marcus, not about anything specific, just a long, unspeakable grief for something she couldn't name, for a version of herself she couldn't quite remember, August came in warm and slow, and Lara began the quiet, disorienting process of examining her own life. She started with small things. What did she actually like to eat? She realized she had been ordering and cooking based on what Marcus preferred for so long that she genuinely wasn't sure. What did she actually think about things that came up in conversation? Not what was appropriate to think, not what would land well, but what she actually thought. What did her body feel like when she was in it, rather than performing for others? These weren't dramatic questions. She didn't experience them as revelations. They came quietly, one at a time, like items on a list that had always existed, but that she'd never been allowed to read. And the reading of them was not liberating. Not at first. It was frightening, because every item on the list was evidence of an absence. Every question she couldn't answer was a place where she had used to be that was now just empty. There was a particular conversation with her mother that she kept thinking about. Months earlier, early in the year, her mother had called, as she always did on Sundays, and she had talked for most of it about her health, about the neighbors, about something Lara's brother had done that she found irritating. And at some point, near the end of the call, she had asked Lara how she was, and Lara had said, "Fine, really good, things are busy but good." And her mother had said, "Good, good, you always land on your feet." And they had said their goodbyes. She thought about that call now, about the 3 seconds it had taken her to answer, about how automatic it had been, about how the truth, which was that she was exhausted and confused and quietly drowning in a life that didn't feel like hers, had not even presented itself as an option. You always land on your feet. She had smiled when her mother said it, had felt, briefly, a small flush of what she recognized as pride. She thought about that now, the pride of being perceived as someone who lands on her feet. And she felt, in place of pride, something much colder. September, a Saturday afternoon. She was alone in the apartment. Marcus was with friends, and she was doing something she started doing more often lately, which was simply sitting, not meditating, not processing, not doing anything intentional, just sitting with herself, with the quiet, with the apartment around her that she had decorated to be neutral, inoffensive, universally palatable. Every choice in it made with someone else's potential comfort in mind. She looked around the room. She looked for herself in it, and she was not there, not in the art on the walls, which she'd chosen because it seemed like the right kind of art for someone like her, not in the colors, which were safe and coordinated and completely without personality, not in the books on the shelf, many of which she had purchased but never read because she bought them to seem like someone who would. She was not in her apartment. She thought about her friends, her close ones, the people who knew her, and she understood something, clearly and for the first time, that she had been circling for months. They didn't know her. They knew the version of her she'd built for them, the agreeable, warm, frictionless version, the one who laughed in the right places and never made things awkward and was always there when needed. They knew the surface, and she had maintained that surface so carefully for so long that there was almost nothing beneath it anymore. She had curated herself out of existence. The breakdown, because that is what it was, even if it didn't look like one from the outside, happened on an ordinary evening, not a significant date. No triggering incident she could point to. Marcus was there. They were talking about something completely mundane, a weekend trip he wanted to plan, something he'd been excited about, and she was nodding, listening, being agreeable in the practiced way she'd been agreeable for years. And then he looked at her and said, "You always go with whatever I want to do. Don't you have a preference?" He said it lightly. He wasn't trying to crack anything open. He was just asking, making conversation. The way you do when you think you already know the answer. She opened her mouth to say what she always said, that she didn't mind, that whatever he wanted was fine, that she was easy, and instead she stopped. She sat with a question. Don't you have a preference? Don't you have a preference? She thought about all the times she'd been asked variations of that question, all the times she deflected, all the restaurants she hadn't chosen, the films she hadn't wanted to watch, the evenings she hadn't wanted to spend the way they were spent, the conversations she hadn't started, the opinions she hadn't offered, the desires she hadn't named, the needs she hadn't expressed, the self she hadn't been. Marcus was still looking at her, and something in her face must have changed because his expression shifted. He said her name with a question in it, and she started to cry, not quietly, not in the composed, manageable way she usually managed difficult feelings. Deeply, from somewhere that hadn't been accessed in a very long time, she cried in a way that frightened her, because it didn't feel like sadness exactly. It felt like release of something under tremendous, sustained pressure, like something that had been held down for years finally surfacing. Marcus held her. He didn't know what was happening. Neither did she entirely. He kept asking if she was okay, what was wrong, what had happened, and through the crying, in a voice that didn't sound quite like hers, she said, "I don't know who I am." Those 5 words. She would come back to them, later would hold them and turn them over and understand, eventually, what it had cost to say them, not because they were dramatic, but because they were the most honest things she had said out loud to another person in longer than she could remember. "I don't know who I am." The room was quiet after she said it. Marcus held her, and she let him, and she didn't manage her reaction or adjust her expression or monitor the emotional temperature of the space they were in. She just cried, and it was terrible, and it was relief, and it was the beginning of something that she couldn't name yet, but that felt unmistakably like truth. The weeks that followed were not clean. There is no moment in real life where the music swells and the light shifts and the person understands everything clearly. That's not how it works. What happened instead was a long, grinding, often deeply uncomfortable process of trying to be honest with herself first. That was the hardest part. Looking at the choices she'd made, not as a victim of circumstances, but as the person who had made them, and understanding why, understanding the fear underneath them, the child logic that had become adult architecture, that the way to keep love is to not need anything, that the way to belong is to never take up too much space, that the way to be safe is to become whatever the room requires. She understood where it came from. She understood that it had made a kind of sense. Once, that it had been, in its way, a survival strategy for a little girl who hadn't had many other options. But she was 26 now, and survival strategies have a cost when they outlive their usefulness. She didn't transform overnight. She didn't have a conversation with Marcus that fixed everything. She didn't tell her manager off in a meeting. She didn't suddenly know who she was and what she wanted and how to live. What she did was smaller and harder and more real than any of that. She started saying things out loud that she would previously have kept silent. Small things at first. "I'd actually rather not. I don't think that's a good idea. Can we talk about that?" Each one felt enormous. Each one was accompanied by the familiar flood of anxiety, the bracing for impact, the waiting for withdrawal, the almost unbearable pause between saying a thing and seeing the response. Sometimes the response was fine. Sometimes it was uncomfortable. Sometimes it created friction she had spent years learning to prevent. And the world didn't end. People didn't leave. The relationships didn't fall apart. They changed shape, some of them. They became something different. Not necessarily worse, but requiring more negotiation, more honesty, more actual contact between 2 real people rather than 1 real person and a performance. It was harder. In many ways, it was much harder, but it was hers. There is a question she would ask herself in the months that followed. She would ask it slowly, not as punishment, not as accusation, just as a practice. When she was about to say yes to something, she would ask, "Is this yes mine?" When she was about to stay silent, she would ask, "Is this silence mine?" When she was about to shape herself to the contours of a room, she would ask, "Do I want to do this? Or am I afraid of what happens if I don't?" Simple questions, quiet questions, the kind that don't announce themselves, the kind that, asked consistently, change everything. She thought sometimes about who she might have been in a different version of things, what she might have said in all the meetings she'd been silent, what she might have felt if she'd let herself feel it, what she might have wanted if she'd let herself want it. She didn't spend too long there. The past is not where the work is, but she held it lightly as a kind of reference point, not a wound, just a mark on a wall from an earlier time, a reminder of how much had grown. This is what no one tells you about people-pleasing. It looks, from the outside, like kindness, And sometimes it is kindness. Sometimes it genuinely is. But sometimes, often, it is fear wearing kindness as a mask. It is a need for approval dressed up as generosity. It is a terror of abandonment performing as warmth. And the cost of it is paid entirely by the person doing it, in silence, in small surrenders, in the gradual erosion of a self, until one day you are standing in the middle of life that looks perfectly fine from every angle, and you realize you cannot find yourself anywhere inside it. Lara is 26. She is still kind. That part was always real. But the kindness is different now. It comes from a different place. It is chosen rather than compelled. It is offered rather than given away under duress. She still says yes often, but the yes means something now. And when she says no, it is not the terrifying, world-ending thing she spent her whole life trying to prevent. It is just a word. Her word. Hers. There is a question, one final question, that hangs in the air after everything. After the tears and the quiet revelations and the long, difficult work of trying to come back to yourself. After all of it, one question. When was the last time she chose herself? She is learning to make the answer. Today.